I swept my hands over soft, creamy flesh made slippery with water and soap, loving the feel of touching her intimately again after so long. From there, I worked my way down her back and sides. As I washed her, I enjoyed the view too. She was slim, but not skinny. Her curves were well-rounded, soft, and gentle. Her waist was trim and smooth. It flared out a little more than I remembered to hips that had no excess flesh. Her butt cheeks were beautifully rounded, soft without being flabby. Below, her thighs were twin columns of wonderfully smooth flesh that blended into beautifully proportioned calves and then shapely ankles. On my knees behind her, I used my hands to urge her legs apart, and I saw something, or rather, I didn't see something. "Wow," I said softly. I stopped soaping her up. My heartfelt comment and the cessation of my hands moving about her body brought her back from wherever Sherry had gone to. "Hey, that is your surprise, mister," she said in mock indignation. "But you have lots of work to do before you get there. So get busy, bub." She was pleased, though. She didn't have any problem telling I was excited about what I'd seen. I got busy, as directed. I really wanted to explore. Before I went there, though, I soaped my fingers well. "Bend over a little, honey," I told her tenderly. She did it without saying a word. It was a topic that had never been on the table for discussion. Now, she had to know what I was going to do, and she was letting me without the slightest protest. We both caught our breaths in distinct gasps easily heard over the sound of water cascading over our bodies. I was afraid I'd hurt her. "That's number 2, she said suddenly, sighing. I flinched a little. "What, hon?" I asked. "That's the second thing I wish we'd at least tried before," she explained. "If I just hadn't been so uptight and stupid and mean," and I cut her off before she went any further down that path. "Well," I said, drawing out the word. I tried to make my voice light and teasing. "Like I said before, we can make up for some lost time if you're willing." She stopped now and settled herself. "Count on it," she said succinctly. "We're going to do a lot of things we should have been doing a long time ago," she said. Again, she sounded excited and happy at the prospect of trying new things. I cleaned my hand off carefully, manipulating the bar of soap between my hands to get them soapy again. I started doing her front. She closed her eyes and lifted her face to mine. The warm water had almost removed all of her makeup. The soap completed the process. In a minute, her face was clean and shining under the coat of soap. I rinsed her face off and was tempted to kiss her, but she wasn't ready for that. We hadn't kissed since I began soaping her up. I didn't know why she wanted this. After all, we'd had us after the last time she'd been with him. But she did, and that was good enough for me. "Do you like it?" she asked. "Oh yeah," I said expressively. "I more than like the smoothness and the view." "Now you have to do me," I told her softly. The look of hurt was washed away in an instant. There was a gleam deep down in her eyes that told me I'd gotten it right again. I was batting 1,000 tonight. She proceeded to soap my entire body from stem to stern, just as I had done her. She paid particular attention to my softly squeezing and massaging as she worked to clean me. We decided to get out of the shower. I think just before we wrinkled up like 2 prunes. Kissing and hugging, we used huge, fluffy towels to pat each other dry, and then dried each other's hair. I drew her into my arms for one long, steamy kiss before we walked, naked as the day we were born, back into the bedroom. On the way, I turned down the rheostat control until the 2 lamps were putting out a dim glow. When we got there, I pressed Sherry down on her back at the side of the bed. I got down between her knees and began to kiss her. "Honey," she urged. "Come up here. I need you," she begged. After a time, we made love again. We talked to each other. "Are we going too fast?" I asked her. She giggled. "I don't think so. It's been 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks, and a few days since we did anything like this," she said. "Wow," I replied. "You've got the timing down that exact?" I paused for a moment. "Hey, does that mean I'm going to have to remember another anniversary or something?" I was being facetious and she knew it, but she changed the humor into something else. "No, baby, this is the only anniversary you'll need to remember from now on," she said softly. "Just today, tonight. I'll write it in my memory with indelible ink, I promised." We kissed again. Then she giggled. I drew back. Don't you remember? She asked in an amused but warm tone. You made love to me just 3 weeks after we met? I sighed. I did remember that. I'd known at that moment that I was the luckiest man alive. Uh-huh, I answered, and a month and a half after that, you moved in with me after making me throw most of my furniture away. I teased. Well, most of it was junk, she said tartly. But your bed was okay, she said thoughtfully. We got a lot of good use from that, didn't we? I chuckled, adding it to hers as we laughed together at the memories. Yeah, we did that, I agreed. We were quiet for a time. Ron? She said quietly. Sherry pulled back until our foreheads no longer quite touched. Honey, I've said it before, but I want to tell you again that I'm so sorry I did those awful things back then, and I'm even more sorry that I hurt you so terribly by doing them. I want to make it up to you for all the bad times, and I will if you give me the chance, please. I took my time answering her. She'd said and done so many things this evening that required interpretation on several levels, and I wasn't sure this wasn't one of them. When I didn't answer, she started in again. Honey, please, I love you so much I can't breathe sometimes, she said passionately. Please, please forgive me for what I did. I don't think I can go on if you leave me, please, darling. She pulled my head to her breast and kissed the top of my head. Her arms were desperately tight around my neck. Shh, I whispered. I made my voice soft and gentle and stroked her shoulders and back. She was in a bad place, but I thought I knew how I could bring her out. Sherry, darling, I said tenderly, I've been needing to tell you something for a couple weeks, and I ought to kick my own ass for not getting it out before tonight. I took a deep breath. Sherry watched my face, half fearfully, it seemed. This needed to end now. Honey, I forgave you for what you did a while back. I'll never forget it, but it's no longer something that is front and center in my mind. It's off to the side, tucked way behind a lot of other things. I rolled onto my back. My left shoulder was well on its way to a full recovery, but it was still possible to overstrain it. Sherry followed me, her left leg thrown over my hips and her chin coming to rest on my chest as she stared into my eyes. I know, I said, saying that sounds awfully arrogant, like I'm bestowing some fantastic, wonderful gift on you, but I don't know any other words except I forgive you. It quit hurting somewhere along the way. I'm not sure exactly when, but I know it was gone before I went to Afghanistan. Actually, it had to be gone long before that, because Karen had it figured before then that you were still on my mind. I stopped for a moment, afraid the mention of the woman I'd had a long-standing relationship with would upset Sherry. There was no reaction I could detect, so I continued. I love you, Sherry, I told her. Whether it's arrogant or not, I forgave you long before I saw you in that delicatessen a couple months ago. After I did see you, I tried to take it slow, but I haven't really been in control of myself since. Can you accept that, honey? She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. I will make it up to you, she said. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it up to you. She kissed my chest, putting her lips down deliberately and kissing each bit of my flesh as if it were the most important thing she'd ever done. I touched her face, urging her to face me again. Honey, you can't make it up to me, I said. Don't you see? All that happened in a marriage that was over long ago. We aren't the same people who got divorced back then. If you try to keep on making it up to me, you'll wind up hating me for letting it dominate you so much. And I don't want you to hate me, darling. I thought furiously, trying to find a way to show her how I felt. Sherry had been working on various bits of symbolism all night long, and she needed one more. I felt the faint tugging of a memory, something to do with the delicatessen I'd just spoken of. Then I had it. Not the delicatessen, it was at Denny's that she'd spoken of this. Honey, where's your purse? The energy I put into the question, as much as the content, caught her attention. She blinked, wondering what I could thinking of. It's downstairs on the couch, I think, she said hesitantly. Good, I said. I was sure I had it now. I scooted my body from beneath hers and stood beside the bed. Come on, I told her, taking her hand and pulling her up. We got to the doorway before she balked. Ron, we're stark naked. What if people see? I laughed. I thought all the drapes were closed tight downstairs, but I really didn't care. Screw him, I said shortly. Let them watch. They'll just have to get used to it, I said, giving her my best leer. She giggled and released her hold on the doorframe. Okay, honey, she said. We stole downstairs hand in hand. I touched a control that turned on a floor lamp. I lit the living room, but only dimly. Sherry, honey, I said slowly, you have that picture in your purse, the one you told me you always carried when we were at Denny's? Her face fell. She'd been excited, hopeful. It must have seemed like I was reverting to a time when I'd used the picture to beat her up pretty badly. I shook my head and smiled affectionately at her. Trust me, honey, I said gently. Just get the picture, okay? While she dug into her purse, I made my way to the fireplace, tossed 3 fire starter logs inside it, and lit them with a long match from the container on the mantel. The imitation wood logs caught immediately and flared brightly. I stood and walked back to my Sherry. She had the photo in her right hand, but she'd forgotten all about it. She loved fireplaces and the fire. So low it barely penetrated the dimness of the room, had her full attention. Honey, I said, stepping up to her and gathering her in my arms. I forgave you long ago, but now you have to forgive yourself too, okay? She looked at me questioningly. Go ahead, I said, releasing her. You need to put this behind you as much as I needed to. We can't move forward until you're willing to let all this slide away into some place where it won't hurt us, you and me, where it won't drag us backwards, you see? I pulled back a step. You have to make a choice, honey. Throw that picture into the fire and let the pain and hurt die with it. If you don't, it's going to destroy everything we try to do for the rest of our lives. She stood there, her nakedness forgotten for the moment. She looked at me intently, her eyes flicking rapidly from one point on my face to another as if she was trying to find some deception there. Are you sure, Ron? She said in a quiet, firm voice. You want us to start over as if it never happened, that I never did something so incredibly stupid and cruel that hurt you so badly you couldn't live with it? Are you sure you want that? Because I'll do what I said. I'll live the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. It won't bother me. I'll do it gladly. She might have added more, but she saw me shaking my head. No, we can't pretend it never happened, I said slowly. Neither of us can ever forget it, but it can be just a reminder of what we can never allow to happen again. Okay? What you can do is let go of the hard edge of guilt I know you're still feeling. Let it go before it turns into a hatred that would turn you against me. Honey, I pulled her tight against me again and kissed her hard. Her eyes were closed, so I kissed them too. Sherry, I said in a low voice, I did forgive you a long time ago. It's time for you to forgive yourself, okay? Honey? She opened her eyes and looked up at me for a long moment, still trying to decide. I want you to forgive yourself, honey, I said finally. For us? She tilted her face up and kissed my lips hard and fast. Then Sherry twisted around in my arms and marched to the fireplace. She tossed the picture atop the log that was blazing hottest. She watched it for a minute, then turned and came back to me. My arms were already spread wide to enfold her and bring her back to me. She began crying and cried for a long time that night, but the tears were a purging of the poisons that had been building for so long. When she woke the next morning, I had my woman back, one who would walk beside me rather than a pace behind. Good people can only hate the things they've done and hate themselves for so long until the venom consumes them. Letting go of the bitter self-reproach was the final bit of the cleansing. Sherry began with the shower. It hadn't been perfect. I'm sure a rational man could find missteps and incongruities in our private little ceremony. I could only wonder that we had managed to work our way through it as well as we had. In the morning, we took another shower together. We washed each other's bodies, but not with the ceremonial intensity of last night. This was a lazier, more sensuous experience. After a while, Sherry tossed the well-used bar of soap aside, giving up the pretense of bathing. Her arms went around my neck, and she kissed me urgently. Backing up against the wall opposite the shower head, she pulled me tight against her. I have another surprise for you, she said hesitantly, if you want. I laughed. My God, woman, I said happily. After last night's big surprise and all the things we're going to explore, are you sure there's anything left to surprise me with? She stuck out her tongue, then got serious. Well, I've got one for when it's just us together like last night. But there's another one that is a little more complicated. She stopped for a moment and then shook off whatever had briefly clouded her facial expression. I'll tell you later, but it's a surprise I hope you'll like, but it's not like this one, she said. There was an impish look on her face. Her eyes were sparkling. Sherry had not been stingy about giving me BJ when we were married, but she'd always done it in the dark or in such dimness I never saw anything. I kissed the top of her head, touching her cheek to bring her lips up to mine. I'd forgotten you don't mind tasting it on me, she said softly. Most of the girls at work say their men won't do that. I laughed. I was recovering slowly. Later I walked over and took the brush away from her and began brushing her long hair myself. I wasn't an expert at it, but I was willing. After a while, I found the right amount of pressure and just how to hold her hair in place at the top in one hand while brushing down hard with the other to painlessly remove tangles and knots. 10 minutes into it, Sherry was completely relaxed and her eyes closed peacefully. In another 10 minutes, we were both letting this drift into an even more intensive foreplay, but we had places to go. Some men, I hear, wouldn't have known what we were doing was a part of foreplay. I felt sorry for them. Regretfully, we were committed to Melissa and Cal's for the afternoon. I did remember one more thing from the night before. Honey, you said you had a surprise for me that wasn't anything to do with us, well, making love or having it. I think that's what you meant, right? Uh-huh, she said slowly. She took a deep breath. Come sit on the bed with me, she said. Her face had a small, worried expression all over it. My forehead suddenly collected a full set of wrinkles. The ringing of a phone broke our concentration. Do we have to answer that? Sherry asked plaintively. I shook my head no. It rang again. Heck, she spat out. My eyes widened. Sherry almost never used swear words. The phone went off a third time. Sherry took a deep breath and let it out. I guess you might as well answer it, she said resignedly. Honey, I replied delicately. It's your cell phone. She rolled her eyes up in embarrassment. I watched her retrieve it from her dress pocket. Hello? Oh, hi, Melissa, she said, looking up at me and smiling. Yeah, I am. We're both very happy. Thank you very much. It seemed to me the conversation was going to be a lengthy one, so I disconnected my brain and went about getting my watch and transferring my wallet, keys, and other stuff from the pants I'd worn last night into the pair of blue jeans I was wearing today. At the last minute, I had a thought. Checking to see if Sherry was watching, I went to my top bureau drawer and searched to find the tiny box I knew was there. Finding it, I checked the content to make sure they were all right and shoved the container into my front pocket. I was ready to go. Okay, Sherry said into the phone. We'll be there in a little bit, bye. Checking up on you? I asked teasingly. She nodded. I really should have called last night to let them know I wasn't, going to make it home last night, but a certain somebody had me tied up in knots all night long, she said cheerfully. I sniffed, holding my head high as if insulted. She didn't buy it. She stuck out her tongue and blew me a raspberry. Ready to go? I asked. She was, and we went. We stopped at her apartment so she could get a change of clothes. She was just going to go get some jeans she could change into over at Melissa's house, she said. She wouldn't be a minute. Don't bother coming in and don't turn the engine off. The air conditioning would take too long to get going again, and it was too hot. So, I sat there. She was, in fact, gone for 3.5 minutes. I was beginning to get irked at this business of her two roommates being an obstacle so huge I couldn't step inside her apartment. I just wasn't sure how to approach the problem. I wasn't going to let it go too very much longer, though. When Sherry came out, she tossed a small overnight bag in the back seat and hung a pair of jeans and blouse on the hook above the door. I saw her also stuffing a sheaf of papers into her purse, but she didn't say anything about them. A few minutes into the drive, I started to ask her again about the surprise, but a small Honda ran past us and darted into my lane just ahead. I had to brake hard and still just barely missed killing 4 high school students. Their white faces as I pulled around them told me they'd been scared into safe driving for at least a little while. Anyway, the sudden shock to Sherry and my emotions drove the topic of her surprises completely out of my mind. The closer we got to Melissa's, though, the more restless Sherry got. She was checking out every control on her door and the dash with fingers that weren't obeying her brain very well. After finding the seat adjustment buttons, she changed her seat's position 10 times in the 9-mile trip. By the time we pulled up outside, she was a nervous wreck. I turned to her and looked at her white face. She swallowed hard. Ron, Honey, she said uncertainly, you know that surprise I've been telling you I need to talk to you about? I nodded. Well, there are actually 2 surprises for you in the house. She took a deep breath. Good, I said quickly, smiling at her and hoping a smile was appropriate. Let's go see my surprises. I got out of the SUV and Sherry got out on her side. We met on the sidewalk beside the passenger side door. Ron, she said sharply. She caught my arm and turned me to face her. Ron, honey, I want you to understand these are your surprises, okay? You have to believe me. They're yours. Will you remember that, darling? Sherry was desperately trying to tell me something that she wasn't telling me, but, unlike last night, I couldn't decipher what it was. She wrapped her arms around my neck and pulled me tight against her as if she was afraid I was going to run away. Honey, I said softly, I believe you. Okay? I don't know what's got you so upset, but I just won't believe you would do anything to hurt me, all right? She kissed me, her lips firm and demanding on mine. Then she leaned back to look at my face closely. Her body relaxed. She composed herself, leaning her forehead against my chest for a moment, and then gave me a warm smile. I'm acting like a schoolgirl, she said a little more calmly. I get myself so worked up, sometimes. I think you're going to like these surprises anyway. Knowing you, she backed away and brushed at the corners of her eyes with a tissue she produced from nowhere. We walked up the sidewalk to the front door holding hands. Melissa met us at the door. She'd obviously seen us outside through the big picture window. So, she said after greeting us both with a hug and a kiss on the cheek. Today's the big day, huh? Sherry nodded and glanced up at me to reassure herself about something. I was getting impatient, but I held it in. Too many people seemed to know what this was all about, and it was getting irksome that I did not. Melissa looked me dead in the eyes and then gave me a smile as warm and affectionate as any I've ever seen on anyone's face. Melissa turned and gave one of those kinds of yells only a mother could. You know the ones I mean. The ones that can be heard all over the neighborhood, especially by the youngsters she's calling. Yep, them's the ones. Cassie, Courtney come in the house, she called. I was impressed. I'd not heard that volume of voice since Afghanistan when the platoon sergeant of our security detail had had an occasion to make himself heard to a group of Marines a couple hundred yards away. I thought Melissa might have been able to duplicate his shout or exceed it. I could see the twin blonde girls racing toward the house from the backyard. In just a very few seconds, they were through the kitchen door and into the living room. I flashed a grin at Sherry. I thought these 2 little girls were something special, and I wanted to share that thought with her. She was looking back at me, her face anxious. Uncle Ronnie, Courtney shrieked. Cassie's voice was just a beat behind. Mommy, she squealed happily. Both girls raced by me without stopping, with Cassie leading. I was a little disappointed. Ordinarily, they wanted a hug when I came over, and I loved to accommodate them. Mommy, Courtney cried when she heard her sister and looked behind me. I was confused. Turning, I caught a glimpse of Melissa staring at me intently, and it distracted me for an instant. Then my poor, non-functioning brain caught up with what was going on around me. I whirled around to find Cassie in Sherry's arms and Courtney hugging Sherry's left leg, hugging her mother's leg. I know my mouth gaped open. I must have looked like a newly caught big mouth bass. I jerked my eyes up to meet Sherry's. Surprise, Daddy, she whispered. I stared. Attacking terrorist guerrillas in Afghanistan, screaming and firing AK-47s at me, hadn't managed this deep a shock. Then I began to come out of it. Well, I got my mouth closed anyway. It had been so unattractive hanging down like that, you know? Mommy, why did you call Uncle Ron, Daddy? Cassie asked wonderingly. I looked down at her to find her gazing back at me. Is Uncle Ron your daddy? She asked my ex-wife. Sherry was looking at me quietly. Her anxiety had fled when her baby daughters had come to her. No, honey, she said softly. He's your daddy. Cassie was playing with the strand of pearls around Sherry's neck. She stopped and looked at me, then back at her mother in consternation. Sherry nodded. Really? She told her daughter. Cassie turned back to me, twisting around in her mother's arms. Are you really my daddy? She asked in her little girl's voice. The beauty of it brought a tear to my eyes, and I was not a man who cried. I cleared my throat. I think I must be, sweetheart, I said gently. Cassie looked at me with astonishment on her face. Then she slapped at my forearm with her little hand. I hadn't even realized I was reaching out to her. She wouldn't have been able to otherwise. "Where were you?" she demanded. The single tear in my eye began to multiply quickly, but I blinked them away. "It's not your daddy's fault, Cassie. He was a long way off building roads and things," Sherry said smoothly. "And you don't hit your father." "Young lady," she scolded. Cassie hung her head and then looked at me. "I'm sorry," she said soulfully. "That's okay, sweetie," I told her. I knew her question had been legitimate. It would have to be answered, but not until she was old enough to understand. There was a tug on the left pocket of my blue jeans. Courtney was holding her arms up to me, wanting to be picked up. That did it. My eyes were swimming in tears now. Courtney saw them as I settled her in the crook of my arm. "What's wrong?" she said sorrowfully. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked plaintively. "No, baby girl," I answered softly. "You didn't do anything wrong at all." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she gave me a hug and started patting the back of my shoulder with her tiny hand. "You don't have to be sad, Uncle Daddy," she said in her child's voice. She pulled back in my arms and covered her little mouth with both hands. She giggled. "I called you Uncle Daddy," she said as if sharing the silliest joke in the world. I couldn't help but chuckle along with her. I kissed her cheek. She looked doubtfully at me for a second. "Don't you want to kiss me like Uncle Cal does, baby Jeannie?" she asked. I nodded. With a pleased look on her face, she leaned in to give me a quick peck on the lips. I couldn't help it now. My throat was choked tight and my manly eyes were betraying me with even more tears. I had to turn away and clear my throat several times before I could face everyone again. "Oh," Courtney said, her young voice brimming with excitement. Her eyes were dancing. "I gotta go tell Ben and Lil Cal and Jeannie," she said enthusiastically. She started squirming in my arms. "Let me down on, Daddy, please," she asked sweetly. I did, and she ran toward the back of the house. "Ben, Cal, guess what? Uncle Ronnie is my daddy," she shouted. She hadn't made it out of the house, nor was she anywhere near her playmates when she started yelling. We could hear her repeating her news over and over at the top of her lungs, all the way across the big backyard. Cassie had deserted her mother's arms a second or two after Courtney left mine. Cassie ran after her sister to share it with the other children. A moment later, she tore back around the doorway and ran up to me. "Kiss," she demanded. I dropped to both knees and gathered her small body in my arms and squeezed her tightly for a moment, then gave her a quick kiss as I had her sister. She wiggled free and ran for the door, screeching happily the whole way. I stood up, watching her until she disappeared outside. I turned back to Sherry. She was standing there quietly with a little smile on her face. She stepped into my open arms and we held each other, rocking back and forth for a long while. "Ron, honey," she said at length, "I'm sorry for not telling you, but things kept getting in the way and I couldn't find the right time. Sometimes I was going to, and like today the phone rang or something." She stopped because I was pressing 2 fingers to her lips. I replaced my fingers with my lips. "It's all right," I told her. "I may spank you later for not letting me know, but it's all right now." She choked up a little. Then she bent down and picked up her purse from where she dropped it when Cassie jumped in her arms. "Ron, it's all here," she said quickly. "I got DNA tests done so you wouldn't think." I had to shut her up with another kiss. She was trying to shove the bundle of papers she hauled from her purse into my hands. "You keep these," I told her. "I don't need to see them." Another kiss was in order and delivered. The sound of someone clearing a throat brought us out of it. "Hey, Ron," Cal said. "Y'all okay?" he asked. I nodded, snaking my arm around Sherry's waist. "I have 2 daughters, Cal," I told him wonderingly. He snorted. "Yeah, how about that?" he said irreverently. "What do you think of Sherry's young roommates, huh?" He grinned at nothing in particular. "I don't know why it was any big surprise to anyone," he added. "Heck, anyone looking at the 3 of you together could tell they were yours." Melissa swatted at him with her left hand. With her right, she was hauling him in close for a hug. She'd been there, crying silently the whole time. "Oh, honey," he said consolingly. "You've been wanting this for months. You don't have to be crying like that all the time." He was hugging her tight and patting her back with his left hand. He didn't quite know what to do with the long-handled spatula in his right. Abruptly, I knew Cal was right. I thought the twins reminded me of someone when I first met them, and it was true. Around the eyes, across the bridge of the nose, my daughters looked so much like my sister that it was uncanny. And now that I knew, I could see everything else about them was totally Sherry. How could I have not seen? I shook my head in consternation. Men, sobbed Melissa, are so dumb sometimes. After we ate, we played 6 different kinds of games with the kids, and then turned them loose to amuse themselves while we played cards. Cassie and Courtney came back every so often just to touch my hand, my face, whatever was within reach, and grin at me, just making sure I was still there, I guess. When they came back together one time, hand in hand, I gathered them up in my arms and sat them on my lap. After I got hugs and kisses from both, I told them that I was never going to leave them again. When I used the magic phrase, I promise, they understood and didn't come back so often. They kept watching me, though, from wherever they were in the yard. They were probably wondering about the next step. Well, I had a good idea what I wanted for that step. I was pretty sure I could make it happen too. Well, almost sure. In the heat of the afternoon, the children were put down on sleeping mats for a short nap. While the kids napped, the 4 adults sat talking quietly in the shade of the old pecan tree at the far end of their huge backyard. After a while, Cal and Melissa went inside to check on the children, leaving Sherry and me alone for the first time in several hours. We looked at each other for a long moment. "Take a walk?" I asked. She nodded. When she was standing, I pulled her close and kissed her. The tinge of concern on her face disappeared. We walked slowly around until we were in the deep shade of a cottonwood that marked the other rear corner of the yard. There, I backed her up against the trunk and kissed her long and deep. I had my hands on her waist. Her arms were slung comfortably around my neck. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked simply. She sighed. She was ready for the question, as I knew she would be. I had a couple of ideas, but I wanted her to tell me what her reasons had been. "I almost did when we talked that time just before we got divorced," she said. "But later I didn't because I was being selfish again," she said quietly. That surprised me, but this seemed to be a day for such things. I cocked my head to one side but didn't say anything. "I wanted you to come back because you wanted to," she explained. "And if we started getting back together, I didn't want you to think I was trying to pressure you." I thought about that for a moment and then nodded. She looked a little taken aback. "To me, it's like when I was trying to get you to cut up that photograph last night," I explained. "With the kids, you were afraid that somewhere down the line, I would come to resent you or them for tying me down with the dreaded responsibilities, right?" She nodded. "Well," I mused, "being a weekend father or a father every few weekends. Heck, it might have been months between visits, and that wouldn't have done them much good. The disruption in their lives would have been rough on all of us." I thought for a few moments. I guess it was for the best, but I still feel a sense of loss when I think about the things I missed. Sometimes a lesser pain has to be accepted to avoid a greater one. "Huh? Is that what you were thinking?" "Something like that," she answered. "Close enough," she added. "But mainly I wanted you to love me for me. I thought that if you couldn't do that, then we weren't going to be a real family and, well, that would hurt my babies even worse in the long run." "Yeah, I know what you're talking about. But we are going to talk about this a lot someday," I told her. "I'm not sure yet that I'm not going to spank you real good for it. But for now, I think you probably were right." She kissed me tenderly. "I knew you'd understand," she said. "I was going to tell you when they were 4. Anyway," she added. I said, trying to juggle dates in my mind. "You were cutting it awfully short, weren't you? Isn't their birthday in 9 days?" She nodded. "I figured you'd work about as fast as you did when we first met," she said teasingly. "Back then you had me whisked off my feet and into bed in 3 weeks flat." I chuckled. We talked about that last night. What we had done after we first met hadn't struck us as odd at the time. The 3 weeks back then, between meeting and first making love, had seemed like an eternity. "You know me so well," I whispered. Then I remembered what I'd brought with me. "We haven't said much about the future," I said, "but we need to now. There's 2 little girls to think of." She smiled warmly, contentedly. "Honey, we've got all the time," I shushed her with a quick kiss. I was learning it was a fast way of silencing her, fun too. I pulled my hips back to get to my front pocket. She couldn't see me fumble the little box open and pick out one of its contents without looking myself. "A sherry," I said softly. "I brought this with me. I was going to ask you if you'd take it anyway. But with the girls, well, it's just that much more important to me." I took her left hand in mine and gently pushed the engagement ring I'd bought for her so many years ago back into place on her ring finger. "Sherry, honey," I whispered. "Will you marry me?" She looked up at me disbelievingly, an expression of profound shock on her face. Then her eyes were awash, the tears coming all at once. She tried to say something but couldn't get it out. "Will you?" I asked. She tried again but couldn't speak. She nodded firmly, even violently. Suddenly, her mouth was on mine, her tongue searching out mine and weaving a twirling, flicking dance with it. "Yes," she finally murmured in my ear when we left off kissing to breathe. We kissed again and walked back to the house. Melissa and Cal had just come outside. Melissa watched us climb the little slope up to the patio with our arms around each other. She smiled happily. Melissa was about to say something when Sherry stuck out her left hand, palm down. Melissa shrieked her surprise. It made Cal jump, and he spilled part of his beer in his lap. Looking up, he saw the glint from the diamond on Sherry's ring finger and immediately knew what had happened. He smiled and gave me a quick thumbs up. "Darn it, Lissa," he complained while he examined the big wet spot on the front of his pants. "If it ain't one thing, it's another," but he was grinning broadly. I took my fiancée and our 2 daughters home to our new house that evening. The girls slept on air mattresses in their new room, pending the rental of a truck to get all of theirs and Sherry's stuff moved. They thought this was about the neatest thing in the world until about 2 a.m. when a thunderstorm rolled across town. Sherry and I woke up to hear 2 little girls crying down the hall because they couldn't figure out where they were, and they were scared. They slept between Sherry and me for the rest of the night, and I know I spent half the night just watching their sweet, angelic faces as they slept. In the morning, we played tickling, wiggling, and, most of all, giggling games until we had to get out of bed for a late brunch. Over the next few months, I was introduced to the whole gamut of father and daughter interactions, such as temper tantrums, fussiness, getting them to bed on time, reading books at bedtime, having them fall asleep sitting on my lap, hugs and kisses galore, you name it, we did it. Sherry and I had to learn to close and lock our bedroom door on those occasions when we wanted to make love. I'd never had children around, and she'd had no lovers while we were divorced, so it was something new for both of us. She laughed for weeks at how I scrambled to get under the covers the first time we heard little voices getting closer down the hallway. I just didn't think the sight of my was something they should have to deal with at the tender age of 4. Well, anyway, we also worked out an agreement with Melissa and Cal to watch each other's kids for a night or weekend every so often. Mommies and daddies needed a little time alone together too. Oh, I'd like to say that it was all honey and roses, but the truth is Sherry and I had a lot of things still left to work out, and some of it was hard work. Sherry had problems dealing with the fact that I'd had a long-term relationship with Karen. She understood it was while we were either on a court-recognized separation or actually divorced, but it still bothered her. The ritual cleansing we'd done in the shower the first night we'd made love since I came home helped, but it didn't completely eradicate her feelings about Karen. I had trouble seeing her point, but I didn't dispute the fact that it was a heartfelt one. And then, one afternoon, Sherry and I pulled in the driveway seconds apart, and I happened to look down from my SUV into her car. For just a split second, the image of the day I'd seen her and her lover at a downtown stoplight came back to me. I shook it off, mostly, but I was shocked something that long ago could come back strong enough to give me cold chills. In the end, we recognized we needed to get some counseling to help us put everything back in perspective. The counselor helped us put the man I'd caught her with and Karen in the same place where we put Sherry's boyfriends and my girlfriends before we met. They were behind a door in our minds labeled, "Don't go there," and we found we could respect those boundaries. It worked, but it took some time. We had some trust issues left to resolve, not many, but some. Sherry understood it would be a long time before I trusted her as unreservedly as I had in our first marriage, but she also understood that I would work on getting to that point just as hard as she was laboring to assure me of its legitimacy. It was a difficult and sometimes painful process reforging the trust between us, but we knew we were going to do it. There were no options we would accept. We had made an irrevocable commitment to each other with our ritual cleansing, and that, plus our children, were too precious to let what we had together die. We worked hard getting us back on track. 7 months after I asked her to marry me again, our 4-year-old twin daughters padded barefooted and in satiny white dresses down the aisle between 2 rows of hardwood pews. They were tasked with scattering rose petals here and there. They did it with remarkable self-confidence and energy. Courtney, in particular, felt it her duty to see that there was no area larger than a square yard without at least 1 petal in it. Sometimes that required backtracking to make sure the coverage was adequate. Every so often, some smiling face would catch Cassie's eye and she would solemnly tell him or her, "My mommy and daddy are getting married," and so we were.